The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 4th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When evening had come, Jesus said to the disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. So one of the important skills in active listening is paying close attention to the question that you're being asked by somebody, because sometimes the question you're being asked is slightly different than what you might have been expecting. And often, it's different from the question that you might be prepared to answer. And this is important when we listen to some of the questions that Jesus asked to his disciples. So for example, in today's gospel reading, right after Jesus calms the storm, he asks his disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Notice that he didn't ask them, "What are you afraid of?" But sometimes when I'm not paying close attention, that's the way I've heard the question. It sounds like Jesus is mocking the disciples for being afraid of very real things that could kill them. But that actually is not the question that Jesus asked. He didn't ask, "What are you guys afraid of?" He knew darn well what they were afraid of. The disciples were correctly afraid of storms on the Sea of Galilee. It can be as smooth as glass, or it can be full of whitecaps. I have seen both when I've been there. And if you are not concerned about waves and storms on the Sea of Galilee, it's because you are a tourist, or you don't know any better. I remember one time, one of my first trips there, we had a guy in our group who was a retired naval officer, and we're sitting there in the hotel, and the breakfast room overlooks the Sea of Galilee, which is usually very pretty, but it was, like Snoopy said, a dark and stormy night. Actually, it was a dark and stormy morning, and you could see the white caps, and I thought, well, that's a little choppy, and the naval officer sat there and said, "I'm not going out in that. I know better. You don't do that kind of stuff." The disciples did this for a living. They were always out in the Sea of Galilee, and they knew the very real and present danger of those storms. The disciples were also correctly afraid of the unknown. See, the problem with the Sea of Galilee is that windstorms arise suddenly and unexpectedly because the winds are channeled through these valleys at both the north and the south end of the sea. And essentially you get because the elevation is very far down and it's very hot, you get these like tornadic-like winds that come out on the sea. And it can happen in bright, sunny days. So the time when I was there and I had brought along the folks from Prince of Peace, some of you were there might remember that we were in Capernaum and we were looking out and it was beautiful, it was sunny, and all of a sudden the wind kicks up and there's whitecaps on the sea. You don't know because it's not like, oh, the clouds are gathering, we're going to have a storm. All of a sudden, suddenly that's the way it is, and all of a sudden it can stop. You don't know. You never really know when to expect these things, and like any normal person, the disciples were rightly afraid of what they couldn't see coming. And the disciples were correctly afraid of stuff they couldn't control. Because they all had to be good sailors as well as good fishermen, but they also knew their limits. And like any normal person, when you reach the limits of what you know you can fix and manage, it can correctly frighten you. It can be dangerous. Jesus knows all of that, and he knows what they are afraid of. So the question he asks is why? Why are you afraid? In some ways, it can sound like the same question, but it's really not. What Jesus is really asking is why, when the disciples face legitimately scary things, they don't think that Jesus cares. After all, that's the question they ask Jesus when they wake him up. Don't you care that we're perishing? We're dying here. Don't you care? Even though Jesus was right there with them in the boat when they faced a legitimately lethal danger, they felt alone and unloved by God. In the midst of the storm, they felt they were alone and they had to fend for themselves because they imagined that Jesus didn't know what was going on. I mean, he was asleep in the stern. And this is a question sometimes people ask, is God asleep in the midst of my suffering? It seems like, it feels like God is asleep. Does God even know? Does he realize the predicament we're in? They felt ignored or forgotten. And maybe that's why they were afraid. Maybe they felt that they were alone and had to fend for themselves because they thought that Jesus didn't care what was happening. That's what they asked. How can you be sleeping through this? They asked Jesus. Don't you care what happens? They felt unloved. And maybe that's why they were afraid. And maybe they thought they had to fend for themselves because, as far as they could tell, Jesus wasn't doing anything. You know, they don't specifically ask Jesus to stop the storm because at this point in the gospel story, they have no reason to believe that Jesus can stand up and say, "Peace, be still," and everything will calm down. But at least they wanted to feel like maybe Jesus would get up and help them bail the boat. But Jesus isn't doing something they can see at the moment, and because he doesn't seem to be doing anything, then they think maybe they're on their own, and maybe that's why they were afraid. So the question Jesus asked the disciples after he calmed the storm was a question he asked them to consider the next time they faced legitimately scary events in their lives. He didn't tell them that there would be no more storms. He didn't tell them they shouldn't be wary of things that really could kill them. He didn't even promise them that no storm would ever kill them. Instead, he asked them to consider why they were so afraid in the midst of the storm. Did they have the courage of faith to meet the dangers head on in spite of their fears? And that's really the question that Jesus asked his first disciples, and a question that Jesus asks us as well. And the faith that Jesus was talking about was not the faith that Jesus would make every storm go away. Don't worry, this will happen, and next time the storm happens, I'll just stand up and say, "Peace, be still," and it'll all go away for you. He doesn't tell them that. Instead, in the midst of any storm of our lives, even the storms that might actually kill us, faith is about the confidence that God knows what's happening, even when we don't fill God in on all the details. The actual confidence to know God is actually aware of everything that's going on, even more than I am. Sometimes, though, it is hard for us to actually act on that faith. We even do it for years and years and years. We do this in prayer, right? Somebody stands up and says, "Oh, Lord, I want you to help my buddy Joe. He's having surgery Tuesday at 9 a.m. at Shady Grave Hospital, and they're going to put a stent in him." Because if we don't tell God all this stuff, God won't know, you know? God actually knows everything even more than you do. And faith is the confidence that God actually knows what's happening around us and to us, even before we do, and even more than we do. And that changes how we face storms in our lives. The faith that Jesus is talking about is the kind of trust that God actually does care about us, even when it feels like God is asleep and should be as agitated about the situation that we're in as we are. I mean, sometimes we feel that people aren't taking us seriously if they don't get as wrapped around the axle about something as we do. Because, my gosh, this is why I have to stop reading Facebook sometimes. Don't you care? You need to be all upset. And if somebody isn't like agitated like that, it means they don't care. And so we think, okay, if God is not going woo in the whirlwind, then maybe God doesn't care. But faith is the conviction that God cares about us and loves us, even if he doesn't seem to get as caught up in the whirlwind of our storms as we do. And that's changing. And if we actually believe that God is that non-anxious presence in our midst that can help us through this and cares about us, that changes how we face the storms in our lives. And the faith that Jesus is talking about is the courage to act in the midst of our fears, expecting God to act, even if we don't know what that action will look like. I mean, at this point in the story, the disciples really could not have expected to know that Jesus could stop a storm. Their problem was that they actually didn't expect Jesus to do anything. I mean, maybe they wanted him to get up and bail out the boat. But sometimes we do this in prayer too. Oh God, I'm in this trouble. I have this great problem. Here's what I want you to do. A, B, C, D, do all these things, and then I will be all right. But what the disciples learned there was that Jesus was going to act, but Jesus was going to act in a way they didn't expect. But God was still going to be working with them, in them, and through them. And faith is not the idea that I can get God to do exactly what I want God to do, but the courage to act, expecting that God is going to do something with me and in me or through me and in, with, or through you, even when we don't know what that action is going to look like. And if we have that kind of faith, that changes how we act and how we face all the storms in our lives. Because in the end, Jesus does not promise us that there will not be storms in our lives. He doesn't tell us that he'll quickly quiet every storm that we face, and he doesn't even tell us that no storm will ever seriously hurt us or kill us. But Jesus does promise us that we can face the storms with the confidence of faith that God is going to be with us through whatever storm we face. Jesus promises us that we can face the storms with the assurance of God's love and care that will always be stronger than whatever storm we happen to find ourselves in. And Jesus encourages us to face storms with the courage to act in the midst of every storm in our lives, knowing that ultimately God is going to bring us through the storm into new life, even through those storms that actually do hurt us and kill us.